Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we are diving straight into a fascinating and pivotal moment that happened right here in Massachusetts in the lead up to the American Revolution, the powder alarm of September 1st, 1774.
Oh, yeah, this is a good one.
It is, and we've got a great collection of historical accounts to dig into. We'll
Yeah.
be detailing exactly what happened, that whirlwind of reactions that followed, and how this seemingly small incident really fits into that growing friction between the colonies and Great Britain.
Right.
And our primary source is going to be these excerpts that we have compiled in the powderalarm.pdf. You can find that on our website if you want to follow along at home.
Yeah, this event is fascinating to me because it was a relatively bloodless act, but it ignited such widespread fear and chaos.
Yeah.
And it really contributed to that revolutionary fervor that was brewing.
Yeah, it's kind of a tipping point.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
today we really want to understand the specifics of the powder alarm, why it triggered such a significant response, and what its lasting impact was as the colonies inched closer and closer to war. You could almost call it a crucial dress rehearsal.
Right.
Even though no shots were fired that day, it revealed a lot of the underlying tensions and definitely shaped future actions on both sides.
Okay, so to really wrap our heads around the powder alarm, I think we need to set the scene first.
Good idea.
What was that political atmosphere like in Massachusetts Bay in 1774? What were some of the big issues that were at play here?
Well, the best way I can describe it is that the air was thick with discontent.
Okay.
Parliament had just passed what the colonists were bitterly calling the Intolerable Acts. And these weren't just, minor inconveniences.
Right.
These were acts that directly targeted colonial self-governance.
Oh, yeah.
Things like closing Boston Harbor and altering the Massachusetts Charter. This all came about in direct response to the Boston Tea Party a year earlier, and the colonists saw these acts as a major assault on their freedoms.
That makes sense. So you've got this already charged environment. And then into this environment walks General Thomas Gage.
Oh, boy.
He's the newly appointed military governor. Well, what was his mission? What kind of challenges did he face trying to keep a lid on things?
He had a monumental task.
I bet.
He had to enforce these deeply unpopular acts and somehow maintain some kind of peace between the patriots, those advocating for independence, and the loyalists who wanted to remain under British rule.
Right. It was very divided.
Incredibly delicate situation. Gage believed that a key way to prevent outright conflict was to quietly remove military supplies from the colonists' reach. His thinking was, pretty straightforward. Less access to gunpowder and weapons means less of a chance of armed rebellion.
Right. Less fuel for the fire.
Exactly. But secrecy was absolutely paramount for Gage.
I can imagine.
He was really worried that if the Patriots even got a whiff of his plans, they would either hide the supplies or try to seize them.
For their own use.
Exactly.
So control the resources, maybe you control the potential for conflict.
That's the idea.
Now, we also need to consider the role of the committees of correspondence.
Yes.
What were these groups and how do they factor into the events as they unfolded?
These committees were absolutely vital. They acted as communication networks that started popping up across the colonies around 1772. Think of them as like an early form of rapid information sharing.
Like their own internet of sorts.
Right. And they arose in response to earlier British actions like the burning of the Gaspee and the Tea Act. They allowed communities to connect, spread news about events happening in other colonies, and start coordinating their responses to these unpopular British policies. And what's particularly interesting is that even with these communication channels buzzing, the Massachusetts colonists hadn't yet formally organized themselves militarily before the powder alarm. So these networks were crucial for the rapid spread of information, both accurate and, false information during the alarm itself.
Wow, so we've got this real pressure cooker situation.
Yeah.
You've got simmering political anger. You've got a new governor trying to kind of stealthily disarm the populace. And you have these colonial communication networks in place ready to spread information.
Ready to go.
Yeah. So let's zoom in on the spark that really ignited this incident.
All right.
The Powder House. Where was it, and why was it such a significant location?
Well, the Powder House, or the magazine, as it was also known, was located near Boston in what's now Somerville. Our sources place it on a hill, which is now Nathan Tufts Park, overlooking Powder House Square. We actually have a description from a 1935 photo that really paints the picture. It was in a very commanding position. The significance of the Powder House was that it held a substantial reserve of gunpowder.
Okay.
And crucially, it wasn't just British government powder, what they called the King's powder, but individual towns in the surrounding area also stored their own supplies within that same magazine.
Oh, wow. So it was a central hub.
Yeah, it was a central hub for a significant amount of colonial firepower.
Okay, so almost like a communal armory in a sense.
Exactly.
Now we need to introduce Major General William Brattle.
Yes.
He headed up the provincial militia
Yeah.
and was appointed by the governor. What role did he play in all of this? Was he seen as taking sides at this point?
Well, publicly, Brattle seemed to be taking a somewhat neutral stance. He was the head of the provincial militia, so he controlled access to the Powder House.
Okay.
What's interesting is that on August 27th, just a few days before the alarm, Brattle sent a letter to Gage informing him that only the provincial powder remained in the magazine. The towns had already removed their stores.
Oh, wow.
So on the surface, it seems like a relatively harmless piece of information.
Just an update.
Right. But it becomes really significant when you look at what happens next.
Interesting. Okay, so Gage gets this news that all the towns have taken their powder.
Right.
And he decides that he needs to secure what's left. What steps did he take?
Yeah, Gage decided to move that remaining provincial powder to what he thought was the safety of Boston. So on August 31st, he dispatched Sheriff David Phipps to get the key to the Powder House from Brattle. But importantly, Gage also started making preparations for troop movements for the following day. And these preparations, they didn't go unnoticed by the locals. Any movement of British soldiers at this point would have been a huge red flag.
I can imagine. So any unusual activity by the British military would have triggered suspicion and unease?
Oh, absolutely.
Now, there's also this mention of a lost letter from Brattle to Gage. What's the story here, and how did it contribute to the escalating tensions?
Well, this lost letter is really a key element of the story. It appears that Gage lost this letter on August 31st.
He just lost it.
Seems that way. And news of its contents specifically that only the King's powder remained spread like wildfire.
Oh, wow.
And most people thought that Brattle was tipping off Gage, warning him to act before the Patriots could seize that remaining powder for themselves. Now, whether that was Brattle's true intention remains a matter of historical debate, but this is how the colonists interpreted it. And that really fueled their reaction. You know, in these highly charged times, perception becomes reality.
It's interesting how, in a time without Twitter and social media, news could still spread so fast.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Okay, so you've got this backdrop of suspicion and this perceived betrayal, and the stage is set for something to happen.
Wow.
Walk us through what happened on September 1st. What actions did the British military take?
In the early hours of September 1st, a contingent of about 260 British regulars from the 4th Regiment, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Madison, they were quietly transported by boat up the Mystic River. They landed near Winter Hill in Somerville.
Okay.
From there, they marched about a mile to the Powder House. Sheriff Phipps met them there and gave them the keys. And just after sunrise, the British troops removed all the gunpowder. Most of the soldiers returned to Boston by river, but a smaller group continued on to Cambridge,
Okay.
where they seized 2 field cannons and transported those back to Boston as well via the Great Bridge and then across Boston Neck.
Okay, so a relatively swift and quiet operation.
Yeah.
No one was hurt. No shots were fired.
Not yet.
And the final destination for all of this seized gunpowder and the cannons was Castle Island,
That's right.
which was a heavily fortified British position, later known as Fort Independence.
Okay, so the British successfully secured these supplies. What happened next?
Well, this is where the alarm part of the story really comes in.
Right.
Removing that powder, combined with the existing suspicion and those circulating rumors, well, it sparked a dramatic reaction.
Okay.
False reports spread incredibly quickly throughout the countryside. People were hearing that British troops were marching in large numbers, that war had broken out, that colonists had been killed, that Boston was being bombarded by British warships. This alarm spread far and wide, reaching as far as Connecticut.
Wow. That's wild that misinformation could spread that fast and incite such a huge reaction. It really goes to show how much anxiety and distrust there already was.
Absolutely.
I mean, we think we have it bad today with the internet, but imagine not even knowing what was true or false.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. You mentioned a traveler in Shrewsbury.
Right.
What did he witness that sort of illustrates this rapid mobilization?
This anecdote really provides a stark insight into the readiness of the colonial militias. This traveler, he reported seeing 50 men fully mobilized in just 15 minutes. They equipped themselves with their arms, they sent out messengers to alert others, and they set off towards Boston. So they were ready to go.
They had some semblance of a system in place even before they were formally organized.
Right.
Wow, that's incredible. Okay, so what was the immediate outcome of all of this? You've got thousands of mobilized colonists. What did they actually do?
Well, on September 2nd, the day after that powder seizure, thousands of armed men converged on Cambridge. Fueled by those alarming rumors and the perceived threat, they engaged in mob action directed at individuals known to be loyalists.
So those who supported the crown.
Exactly. William Brattle himself, along with other government officials, was forced to flee to Boston to seek protection from the British Army. Even Sheriff Phipps, who had just been carrying out Gage's orders to get the key, he was forced to publicly distance himself from all government actions just to try to appease the angry crowds.
Wow. So even though a lot of those initial reports were false, the reaction was very real.
Oh, yeah.
And it had immediate consequences for anyone who was seen as siding with the British.
Definitely.
Eventually, though, the initial panic began to subside as more accurate information came through. Is that right?
Yeah, you're right. As more reliable accounts of what had actually happened began to circulate, the militia units, many of whom were still on their way to Boston, started to turn around and head back home.
Okay.
The immediate crisis was averted, but, the underlying tensions were still incredibly high, and they had really crossed a major psychological Rubicon.
Right. Okay, so the initial alarm fades, but what were some of the long-term repercussions of the powder alarm? Let's start with William Brattle. How did he try to explain his actions? What ultimately became of him?
Brattle publicly maintained that he never intended to warn Gage to seize the powder. He insisted that he had simply given Gage an inventory of what was in the storehouse when asked. He even went so far as to have his letter to Gage published on September 5th in an attempt to clear his name and quell the accusations.
Right.
But despite all of this, Brattle remained a loyalist. And as tensions continued to escalate, he ended up seeking refuge on Castle Island during the siege of Boston. He eventually left with the British forces when they evacuated in March 1776. He died in Halifax. His attempt to stay neutral, it ultimately failed.
Yeah, he couldn't walk that tightrope.
Nope.
So let's take a broader view here. What did the powder alarm reveal about the sentiment in the colonies overall?
Right.
John Adams, who was attending the First Continental Congress at the time, had some interesting thoughts on this, didn't he?
He did. John Adams was writing from Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress was in session, and he described the impact that even just the rumor of a bombardment of Boston had on the delegates.
Wow.
He wrote that it made them completely miserable for 2 days, and that the overwhelming sentiment was war, war, war.
Yeah, they were ready to fight.
They were ready. He noted the strong sense of unity and determination across the colonies, stating that the fervor for resistance in their discussions would have done honor to the oratory of a Briton or a Roman.
It really shows you how that idea of armed conflict was gaining traction.
It was becoming more and more real.
Now, what about General Gage? How did he interpret this huge colonial reaction to what he had done?
Well, Gage was taken aback by the scale and intensity of the colonial response. It caused him to reconsider his strategies, and he actually postponed and then canceled a planned second expedition to seize more military supplies that were in Worcester.
He realized he might have poked the bear a little too hard.
He started to understand that the colonists were far more organized and interconnected through those committees of correspondence, and much more willing to react with force than he had anticipated.
Yeah, he underestimated them.
It really challenged his initial assessment of the colonial threat.
And that prompted him to take more serious action.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't just dismiss it.
No. He concentrated his existing troops in Boston, and he sent a pretty urgent request back to London for reinforcements. He actually wrote that if they thought 10,000 men was sufficient, they should send 20,000.
Wow.
Arguing that a show of force would actually save lives and money in the long run.
Right, scare them into submission.
Exactly. And while his request was met with some skepticism back in London, he did eventually receive a smaller contingent of Marines. And after that, he really doubled down on his efforts to find and secure colonial military supplies and fortify Boston in case of attack.
So the powder alarm didn't lead to de-escalation. It had the opposite effect.
Yeah, it hardened the resolve on both sides.
So how did the Patriots, in turn, adapt their strategies after all of this?
The powder alarm was a real wake-up call for the Patriot movement. Militia forces throughout New England became much more vigilant about their supplies,
Okay.
and they significantly increased their efforts to gather intelligence on General Gage's plans and the movement of British troops.
Yeah.
Paul Revere, with his network of contacts and his visibility in Boston, he became an even more vital figure in getting that crucial information out to the surrounding communities.
And it wasn't just about gathering intel.
Right.
The Patriots began to take steps toward formalizing their military preparations as well.
Yeah, on September 21st, just a few weeks after the Powder Alarm, Patriot leaders met in Worcester, and they issued a call for towns to organize a third of their militias into special companies of Minutemen.
Minutemen.
These were elite units that were specially trained and ready to mobilize very quickly.
Yeah, at a moment's notice.
Exactly. They also formalized and expanded the systems of express riders and those alarm networks, which, as we know, proved absolutely critical in the events leading up to Lexington and Concord.
Right.
And in October, in direct defiance of the Massachusetts Government Act, the former colonial legislature reconvened as the first provincial Congress. They formed a committee of safety to oversee military preparations, and they recommended that a quarter of the militia be designated as Minutemen.
So you're seeing the formation of a more organized and rapidly deployable Patriot fighting force.
Exactly.
And they started to think strategically about the security of their resources as well, right?
Yeah, they made a really strategic decision to start stockpiling military stores inland, away from the vulnerable coastal regions.
Okay.
Gunpowder, weapons, other essential supplies. They wanted to make it much more difficult for the British to seize them in surprise raids. Towns like Concord and Worcester became key storage locations. This is a big reason why those locations became targets for the British in April 1775.
Right, which is a whole other story.
A whole other deep dive.
Which sets the stage for Lexington and Concord. So what was the British reaction to these increasingly bold and organized actions by the colonists?
The British also stepped up their game. In early December 1774, the British government voted to completely prohibit the export of arms and gunpowder to the North American colonies. And they started actively securing any remaining stores they could get their hands on. This is what led to Paul Revere's famous midnight ride to Portsmouth.
Ah, yes. I was wondering if we were going to get to that. It sounds like another instance of trying to secure powder, but with its own unique set of circumstances. Tell us more about that one.
Revere had gotten intelligence that the British were planning to seize the military stores at Fort William and Mary in Portsmouth, New Hampshire.
Okay.
So he rode there to warn the local patriots.
And this intel was accurate?
It actually turned out to be inaccurate, but they didn't know that at the time.
Okay.
So acting on this information, the local militia forces, they raided the fort on December 14th, and they successfully removed the supplies, including a bunch of gunpowder and cannons, before the British ships even arrived in the harbor. And then, get this, when the British ships did finally arrive, a local Patriot pilot, he deliberately guided one of the ships into shallow water at high tide.
Oh, no.
Which really frustrated the British captain.
I bet.
And effectively delayed their ability to react.
Talk about a clever act of local resistance.
It really was.
And were these isolated incidents? Or were there other similar actions taking place in other colonies?
Oh no, this was happening all over. Patriots in Rhode Island and Connecticut also took action to secure gunpowder, what they called the militia's powder, from forts in Newport, Providence, and New London. And they distributed these supplies to local militias further inland, mirroring the strategy adopted in Massachusetts.
Okay.
And even within British-occupied Boston and nearby Charlestown, colonists were working to smuggle out cannons and other supplies.
Wow. So it was this constant cat-and-mouse game.
Exactly.
With both sides trying to gain an advantage.
Both sides trying to get one step ahead.
And this all culminated in that standoff in Salem in February 1775. What happened there?
In Salem, a contingent of British regulars under Colonel Alexander Leslie, they tried to confiscate weapons that they believed were being stored in the town. But when they arrived, they were met by this group of local citizens who raised a drawbridge blocking their way.
Oh, wow.
And while they were delayed, the Patriots moved the cannon to safety.
So they got away with it.
Yeah. By the time the bridge was lowered, the weapons were gone, and reinforcements from neighboring towns had started to arrive.
Oh, wow.
It was a tense situation, but there was no bloodshed. And it really demonstrated the growing resistance of the colonists and how willing they were to openly defy British authority.
So you trace that thread from the initial spark of the powder alarm through all of these subsequent events.
It's a chain reaction.
Yeah, and you can see how tensions were rapidly escalating. It really was a dress rehearsal.
Absolutely. The powder alarm heightened existing tensions, it spurred the Patriot movement to organize better and faster, and it influenced the actions of both the British and the colonists in those crucial months leading up to the fighting at Lexington and Concord. It showed the British how quickly the colonists could mobilize, and it showed the Patriots that they needed better communication, stronger organization, and more secure supply lines.
So to wrap it all up, the powder alarm, even though it didn't involve any actual fighting, was a profoundly significant moment.
It was.
It laid bare the deep distrust, and it revealed that capacity for rapid mobilization among the colonists. It showed the British government's intention to control the military resources, and it was this pivotal early indicator of the escalating conflict, and really pushed both sides down the path to war.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And what I think is particularly thought-provoking is that chain reaction that followed the powder alarm. The accelerated organization of the colonial militias, the establishment of those alarm systems, the decision to stockpile supplies inland, all of these things point to a much more prepared and resilient Patriot response just a few months later in April 1775.
Which leads us to our final point for you, our listener. Considering all of this, how might those events at Lexington and Concord have unfolded differently without this dress rehearsal of the powder alarm? What does this tell us about the role that seemingly small events can play in shaping major historical outcomes?
Right.
And what can we take away from this about the power of information and misinformation and the speed of communication, even without modern technology, in shaping public opinion and driving people to action?
Yeah. Lots to think about.
It really is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.